I'd like to introduce today's guest host. Today, we are delighted to welcome Mark Iverson. Mark is the group leader at the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics and leads the Vital IT group in Lausanne. As part of SPHN's Swiss Federated Genomics network, which includes building a federated EGA node, Mark's group will be responsible for the planning and technical implementation of the application layer. With the prospect of building a Swiss federated EGA, we are particularly excited about today's presentation. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mark, who will introduce today's speakers.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's SPHN webinar entitled EGA and Federated EGA, Providing Global Discovery and Access to Sensitive Human Data. As some of you may know, Federated EGA or FEGA is a network of connected resources that enable transnational discovery of and access to human data for research, whilst also respecting countrywide data protection regulations. And we are really keen to hear from Dr. Mallory Freeberg and Dr. Teresa Daltry about the EGA, and hopefully they'll tell us about the latest development of the federated EGA, because these federated resources, they play a major role in the context of European initiatives, such as the European Genomics Data Infrastructure, the GDI, and the European Health Data Space, which I'm sure we'll hear about in more detail in a minute. So without further ado, let me shortly introduce our two speakers. Mallory Freeberg has a Bachelor of Science and a PhD in Bioinformatics. She is currently coordinator for the European Genome-phenome Archive, the EGA, which is jointly run by EMBL's EBI and the Center for Genomics Regulation in Barcelona. In her role, she's responsible for overall delivery of EGA services and coordinating the EGA roadmap with external project partners. Mallory is also heavily involved with federated EGA and other projects aimed at enabling discovery of and access to sensitive human data globally for research purposes. Teresa Daltry is a scientist now working as a project manager and coordinator for the EGA. She works in the team embedded at the CRG in Barcelona. Teresa earned her PhD in biomedicine from the UPF University of Barcelona in 2013, and then worked as a postdoc for the Biotech Research and Innovation Center, the BRIC, in Copenhagen and the University of Copenhagen. Teresa joined the EGA in 2020 and coordinates a team of project managers overseeing various projects. So thank you so much, Mallory and Teresa, for being with us today, and we're really looking forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, for the nice introduction, and I'm relieved to say that, yes, what you mentioned, it will be talked today. Yes, we will cover the points you mentioned. So it was like a few. Good. I'm just going to start. It will be, so this talk will follow flow in a way in which we'll present you some problems, or let's call them issues, that we as a scientist encounter in our work, and then let's present you all with some solutions that we have. So as you all know, the advances in the technology related to genome sequencing have provided the scientific community with a huge amount of data recently. I call it recently, in the last 20 years, we can say. And this genomic data is sequencing data, genomic data. It's a bit of a special type of data, I like to say, because it's very dense in information, it's rich in information. You can use it a lot of times and for a lot of purpose, and every time can bring you new results. This is something that makes this type of data a bit different from others. So for everything, but precisely for human genomic sequencing, it's very, very important that we can reuse it as many times as we can to squeeze all the juice out of it. It's also some data which is especially hard to produce, expensive, and technically challenges. And you know, from the beginning of the Human Genome Project, we all know the project that generated the first sequence of the complete genome of a human person. That's already precisely 20 years ago, actually, 2023. That the sequence was optimized and precisely completed. So from that time, it came up really the need to regulate the sharing of this sequencing. Actually, it was in the 96 when all the scientists involved in this project aligned what it's called the Bermuda Principle. So they met in the Bermuda Island, not a bad place for a congress indeed. And they precisely defined that all DNA sequences coming would have to be released in publicly accessible databases 24 hours after the generation. And at that moment, that was a very innovative idea and was meant to contravene the just the typical practice in science to make the data available to the other scientists only after publication. So when it came to human genome sequencing, they were really saying like, okay, no, well, this is so valuable data that we have to make it available to everybody right away. And, you know, we are still there. This is not yet a reality, but a lot of people is working to promote this. And a lot of things happen. And we are a bit farther now, and we have kind of completed this idea with the idea of the FAIR principle. I'm sure you have heard of it. We want research data to be made findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's a few years we are talking about this, and I can really see this as an extension and worked over the Bermuda Principle somehow. So this really talks about genomic sequencing to be made findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this, it might be easy for some types of data, but when it comes to data which is heavy, it brings huge computation, and it's sensitive data. This is really challenging. So you need some tools. To complicate it a bit further, probably they didn't have those complications when the Human Genome Project started. We have some regulation. Luckily, we have them right nowadays. And specifically talking about the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, these protect all sensitive information coming from living individuals in the European Union. There's other regulation in other places of the world. This is the one we have to deal with. This protects genome sequencing of people. And actually DNA sequencing, so genome sequencing is a very special type of sensitive data because it's actually non-anonymizable. Why is it? Because you can take off the name and some identifiers, but the sequencing of your genome, it describes you. It inherently contains all the information about you. So it keeps being a sensitive information, even though it has been, even when it is anonymized. So there is some problems in sharing of this data. And this scenario, which I described, it puts the scientist in what I like to call the scientist dilemma, ethical dilemma, right? On one side, they tell us this data is so valuable, you really got to share it with the community. But this data is also so sensitive and private, you have to protect it. So what do we do in the middle? So at the EGA, our core mission is precisely to help the scientific community to deal with this dilemma. And we like to help people to make the data as open as possible and keep it as close as needed, following the FAIR principle indeed. Like the EGA really work on each of the letters or help you working on each of the letters of the FAIR principles. With a few more words, the European Genome-phenome Archive is a global network that offers service for the archiving, it doesn't have an expiration date, so it's a permanent archiving, and offers the possibility of sharing of every personally identifiable genomic and phenotypic and clinical data. And this data, it is generated in the frame of biomedical studies, also on healthcare institutions for the purpose of research-focused activities. So this is what we are and what we do, and it's called Genome-phenome precisely because we have genomic information with attached phenotypic and metadata information. I'm going to tell you a little bit how does this work, how does this big system work. So I start really with the EGA in a nutshell. So made it very simple. So we have data providers, and these are researchers and healthcare institutions who generate genome sequencing data, and they deposit at the European Genome-phenome Archive in here. The data is stored, long-term stored, and metadata is exposed to the public. We have other requesters who have an interest in the data, and they request access. When they request access, we pass the request to the data providers, which are the data controllers of that data, to talk in GDPR terminology. And if it's granted, the data can be used to complement, validate, or empower other studies. So really amplifying the value of the data. With a tiny bit more of detail, without really going technical on this, because I don't think it's the purpose for today. When we receive genomic data and associated metadata, we store it safely. The data is encrypted. The data is inaccessible to unauthorized use. Actually, we are proud to have a very great service indeed for this. The data is also backed up in several off-site locations. So this is very safe. It's actually much safer than it could ever be in any just server of a research institute, because that's, is what we do, is our business. So we do it properly. And at the same time, we make metadata discoverable. So the description of the data is in our website and is mined and is searchable. So this is step one, right? When we receive data. So the data is there, the metadata is searchable. Someone else can go and see a data set they want to use, some other scientist. So what happened in there? We verify identities. This is all access, permitted access. And then we send a request to the data controller of the data set. I really want to highlight and stress it. Sorry if I repeat myself, but the EGA never takes decision on who can use and see what data. This is out of our scope, because, to talk in GDPR terms, we are not data controllers of any data. The rights to grant access or deny access to any of our data sets is all the time maintained on the data controller. So if you deposit the data as the EGA, you will decide who use and see your data, not us, never. We never do that. We are data processor, and who generated the data is the data controller. So back to my scheme, we receive a request, we send the request to the data controller, and if the request is, if the access is granted, then we manage the permission, and we have a system that makes possible that only those who have the access can see the data set and no one else can see it. The data is downloadable in an encrypted version, and it's all of this is done in a secure and approved way. And when I say in a secure and approved way, what do I mean? Because I might say that we are very good, and you can just think that I've got a very big ego. But actually, everything we do, it follows international standards, which are set by the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. We work together with them. Indeed, we are a direct project, and we set with them standards for the best way to work with this type of data, so regarding permission, encryption, and all the type of services we offer. So we are in a long-term partnership with the Global Alliance. I hope I'm not going too fast. And so everything I described so far, it was really technical, and it sounds like, okay, but as a scientist, what's in here for me, right? So I just want to bring up a little example of what does the EGA do for the scientific community, really. And this example comes from a paper which is a bit old. It was deposited about 10 years ago, and it was a paper with a sequencing of breast cancers. And it was a great paper. It was very praised by all the scientific community on the topic at the moment. And it got a lot of citation, but the citation of this paper is not what it made it special, in my opinion. The data set of the sequencing was deposited at the EGA. And what is really great about this is this data set was reused and gave rise to more than 147 publications. It means 147 other people around the world reused that data set and produced new results valuable for the scientific community. I think this is really amazing and great. You know, they started sequencing these cancer patients and they found out genetic risk factor, you know, this gene signature for the prognosis, and then also they work with microRNA protein involved in the breast cancer, epigenetic profiling as well. And recently, this data set was even used for some studies that is not on the breast cancer field outside. So they used it to outline some pan-cancer signature and gene pathways. So it really went even farther out of their field. And this is what we call data upcycling, which is something we are very proud of, being able to power really data upcycling for science and with our data. The EGA, European Genome-phenome Archive, as I think Mark already said that, I will repeat anyway, is it's a huge service. There's a lot to do in here, and we are very, very happy and lucky to have a wonderful team behind it. The team is split in 2 locations. We have a part of the team in Cambridge at the EMBL EBI, and another part in Barcelona, where I'm at the moment, at the CRG. We use the critical help of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center as well for hosting facility with their supercomputers. And I want to give you some numbers because I think it's interesting to see the size of it, right? We are going on 2023, we are going to hit the 20 petabytes of data, 20 terabytes of data. So it's a lot of data that we have in here. It's really big. And we have submitters. So you have this pie chart in here with the countries from which our submitters are. I've got the same pie chart for the requesters, for the data requesters. So we have data coming from all around the world. And you can see it's interesting. We also have a lot of data coming from the USA. In the USA, they have a similar archive, but still there's data from the USA coming to the European Genome-phenome Archive, and that's very nice for us to see. So really a lot of data coming from a lot of places. And the description I gave you so far, the explanation I gave you so far, I think paints really the description of kind of a library, really purely an archive. So data in, data out. I could have said books in, books out. But this is really just a part of the reality. It's a part of the truth, because actually we are involved in a lot of projects where we are partners as another research institute or a laboratory. These are the projects we are involved at the moment. You can count more than 20 logos on the screen. And they span a lot of different topics and fields. So there are some projects which have really a scientific field, like, for example, cancer, like you can count here in the middle, rare diseases. We have a few on rare diseases, so RD as well, or leukemia, especially myelodysplastic syndromes for Genomic for all, and we have cardiovascular diseases, we have on mental health. We have really a lot on different scientific topics. So we span so many topics because what we bring is always our expertise on genomic data management. So on fair principles and data management for this type of data. There is another very important type of project, if we want to categorize them somehow, right? In which we are involved, which are the one building infrastructure. It's very important. It's a very important thing in Europe at the moment to guide and regulate the infrastructures for the sharing of health-related data, genomic data among other types. So there are a lot of initiatives for that. And European Genomic Data Infrastructure, GDI, is one of them, as Mark mentioned, and we are very active in there with the European Genome-phenome Archive. And Healthy Cloud is another, and AOCAM is kind of another if still involved in cancer. So we are partnered probably all the initiatives in Europe trying to build infrastructure for genomic data sharing. And you will hear more about our expansion in Europe from Mallory, which I leave the floor now.
Thank you, Teresa, for that wonderful introduction to the EGA, what we do. And I'm going to pick up here and expand a bit more about sort of where we've been. So the EGA has been around for about 15 years now, and so I'm going to pick up where we've been for maybe the past 5 years and where we're going in the future. And Teresa nicely introduced, all of these projects that we're involved in, which are really all aimed at promoting data sharing. And in fact, about 5, 6, 7 years ago, it became clear that this model where we have these sort of centralized core archives that are sharing data are not really sufficient to share the amount of data that is coming in, amount of this genomic and other types of omics data coming from research and also starting to come from healthcare initiatives. So in 2018, in fact, there was a declaration of cooperation signed by more than 20 different European countries. There's a map here on the right, recognizing the need to and committing to creating sort of a European-wide data infrastructure for sharing this type of sensitive genomic data, with the ultimate goal through this 1+ million genomes initiative of sharing at least 1 million sequenced genomes across the EU by 2022. And in fact, even more specifically, was recognized the need that, so in the past, a lot of this data has been coming from sort of the research, biomedical research area, but recognizing that more and more of this data is now coming from the health space. So using this type of data for diagnostics, precision medicine, or even from healthcare initiatives, but for research focus. And this launched the European Health Data Space Initiative, recognizing again that data sharing is really needed to sort of accelerate how we're implementing or using this type of data in a health setting. So this 1+ million genomes initiative, a European-led initiative, launched a number of projects. One of the first major projects being Beyond 1 Million Genomes, to start to set up the support for how we will coordinate generating and sharing this type of data within Europe. And as this project winds down, one of the newest initiatives, which Teresa mentioned, the European Genomic Data Infrastructure, or GDI project, this started at the end of last year, and this project really aims at setting up the technical infrastructure to start to share this data across Europe. And these initiatives were completely aligned with where we were seeing the EGA developing. So about 6, 7 years ago, we started thinking about this concept of a federated EGA service. So taking the over a decade's worth of expertise and knowledge gained in how to manage access to sensitive genomic and phenotypic data, recognizing that it's really depended on being able to reuse standards and implement standard sets of APIs to communicate about sharing data, building upon the standards being developed out of GA4GH. So we already had this idea of federating the EGA, and so this aligned very nicely with these European-wide initiatives, and became clear that we would be able to exploit what we've learned to develop solutions to this data sharing. And I'll just step back a bit to, again, contrast this centralized data access model, so shown in the middle here, where let's say you're a research in South America and you have to access individual repositories of data that you want to analyze as part of your research and download and analyze them locally. This is sort of the model that EGA had been operating and a lot of other resources have been operating. But again, moving towards this idea of federating this model. So now you're a researcher and you can maybe send your analyses to different data sets around the world to run the analyses locally. And then you only have to download aggregated results, for example, which is much more sustainable. But then there's other approaches to federating, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so I'm going to sort of take a detour into talking about the challenges of a centralized data access model, to sort of motivate why this federated approach that we've taken for Federated EGA and other initiatives is really valuable. So I'm going to focus on some challenges around finding data, so data discovery, being able to manage access to that data. So as we mentioned, it's really important to prevent unauthorized access to this personal type of data. And also to get around or to make sure that we are adhering to different regional and national data protection regulations like GDPR, but there are also sort of country-specific regulations that can potentially be more restrictive in some cases. So if I focus on this data protection regulations challenges, so this challenge means that data being generated in a particular country or jurisdiction are sometimes not physically allowed to be moved across borders. So there's very strict restrictions on where the data can be physically stored. And in a federated model, so I'm showing here a map of Europe and different countries highlighted that have started to engage with us with Federated EGA. So we have the standard EGA, what we call central EGA, located in the UK and Spain. But also nodes set up across Europe. So these are indicated by the little EGA logos. And so data in these countries can be generated locally, stored locally, but then become part of this Federated EGA network. So those are the black lines connecting the different nodes. And these lines represent, for example, public metadata being able to be shared between the nodes and central EGA to enable discovery. So the data can remain local and within national borders, but discovery can happen across the network. So a federated approach like this is able to ensure that data are adhering to whatever data protection regulations are being applied to that data. And as I mentioned, this also supports discovery. So for example, the EGA currently has a website where you can search for some keywords of interest. So for example, here searching for lung cancer. And in the centralized model, this would only search for this key term within data archived at the central EGA. But now within this federated network, you can actually search for example, lung cancer and see that, oh, there are X number of data sets in the central EGA archive, but also there are 3 data sets in the German node and 5 data sets in the Spanish node. And so being able to search over the public metadata like this is one of the benefits of having this federated network. And diving down into some more exciting developments happening to support discovery. So there's a standard that was developed as part of the Global Alliance, and EGA being one of the main drivers of developing and adopting this standard, which is called Beacon, which enables more complex querying. So the example I showed before was a pretty standard free text string search, but let's say you're interested in finding data within a federated network that covers a particular variant at a particular location in the genome. So you can turn this search into a query that you can then send to this Beacon API, which then spreads out across the network and asks each of the nodes, do you have data covering this variant, and can return answers, for example, yes or no, we have data, or can even, in some cases, return more detailed information about how many samples, how much data are covering this variant. And then in an even more exciting development of this Beacon standard called Beacon v2 or version 2, enables even more enhanced querying over lots of different additional types of information. So not only information at the genomic level, but also searching over clinical and phenotype information, so disease information, for example, over curated variant annotations, and also over data use conditions. So in specifically looking for data that, for example, can be used in lung cancer research. So we know there are restrictions on how, sometimes what data can be shared depending on what research is being done. And so again, if you have this federated network, you can send these queries across the network to return results and provide additional data sets that could be relevant for your research. Finally, I'll talk about data access. So again, in a central model, if you're searching for data in different repositories, you likely will have a different login credential. So you have a different username and password to sign into each resource and then access the data of interest. In a federated model, though, it became clear that we needed a unified way, an automated way for all these different nodes to talk to each other and be able to confirm the identity and permissions for a given user. And so we use multiple different standards to support this, which again, many of these have been driven through the Global Alliance, and EGA and Federated EGA have been early adopters of these. So the first I'll mention is a standardized and machine readable representation of researcher identities, so who you are, and authorized data sets, so what data you're allowed to access. And this is the GA4GH passports and visas standard, which works very similar to how our passports and visas work, which represent who we are and identify where we're allowed to travel. And again, as long as all of the nodes in a federated network adopt this standard, the same user identity can be used to log into all the different nodes. We are also very proud to have been a driver for an encryption standard that was developed out of the Global Alliance. It's called GA4GH. I won't get into too many details, but just to say that it's a quite safe and standard, efficient way to encrypt data files, which allows things like querying within the data file without having to do a full decryption. So it saves a lot of time and effort decrypting and re-encrypting sensitive data. We've also been a driver for the development and early adoption of the data use ontology. So this is a standard set of vocabulary terms that represent the different conditions and restrictions on how data can be reused. And this is really important both for the data controllers to clearly define the conditions by which the data they're generating can be shared, but also helps with the access component as well. So if I'm a researcher and I want to access a particular data set, I can actually see these terms and see under what conditions I would be granted access to make decisions about whether to go through the access process. And finally, just more general, having standard authentication authorization systems. So authentication is identifying who an individual is, and authorization confirming they have access to data. This is also key towards different nodes in a federated network being interoperable. And so we've been, again, involved in the Elixir Life Science login. This is the Elixir's authentication and authorization infrastructure, and also adhering to standards coming out of GA4GH. And these work very nicely with the passports and visas I had mentioned earlier. So again, making data access requesting and identifying who has access to what data, it needs to be sort of scalable in this way. So I've covered these three aspects of data discovery, data access, and adhering to these data protection regulations. And I've started to give some examples of how Federated EGA is making use of these. But I'll now talk a bit more about sort of where we're at. So Federated EGA, again, is the federated network that's sprung out of the EGA service. And like the EGA service, the Federated EGA strives to support both discovery of and secure access to the sensitive human genomics and phenotypic data globally, while also ensuring that we can respect the national data protection regulations that are evolving country to country. And ultimately, this is towards the goal of both accelerating basic and life science and disease research to understand and improve human health. So for the researchers, they can really benefit from a network that is using common standards, shared interfaces, so you don't have to have, for example, separate login credentials for accessing data within the network. Also, it means that there's sort of shared data models and harmonization for the data actually in the network, since we have to share the metadata to support discovery. So this, again, improves the fairness and adheres to the FAIR principles that Teresa mentioned earlier. And I also mentioned, the use of a standard user identity that you can use across the network. For national nodes that want to join such a federated network, again, one of the main benefits is being able to make use of the shared expertise and knowledge gained over the past decade at least of similar groups, facing the same challenges, assessing different solutions and coming together around some shared solutions for these challenges. And also alluding to what Teresa mentioned earlier with the example of the breast cancer data set in EGA, being reused to the point where almost 150 publications have come out of just reuse of a single data set. We can definitely see that sharing data within a federated EGA network will increase data reuse. You will expose the data to more potential researchers, and hopefully having these shared processes for discovery and access means the data are more easily reusable. And again, joining sort of a network of collaborators who are sharing operational processes and developing technical standards together that are aiming to be interoperable. It just means joining a community that's already sort of going and implementing solutions. And we also see actually an opportunity here to have shared approaches to training and outreach and other types of ways to engage with users. So to date, we've had, so last year we officially launched the Federated EGA with the signing of the legal agreements with the first 5 Federated EGA nodes. These are here indicated on the map in Spain, Germany, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. And the other colored countries in the map are countries that we're engaging with in various steps. So from early just, interest in joining Federated EGA to countries and nodes that are actively engaging in the technical and operational work, as well as the governance work to join Federated EGA. And to date, over 25 different countries and national initiatives are engaged in these various levels. And I'm really excited to say this is not just limited to Europe, which is where, a lot of the initial motivation came from, for example, the 1+ Million Genomes Initiative, but we're actually talking to multiple countries located in North and South America, different initiatives in Africa and Australia. And so really underlying all of this is the need to be using shared standards, common standards to ensure that the network is interoperable. And no matter where you are, what you're doing, what infrastructure you have, you can still benefit from joining this federated network. Taking the learnings of onboarding the first 5 inaugural nodes, which was really heavily worked on, I would say, the past 2 to 3 years, we've developed sort of a journey, a path at quite a high level for how to join the Federated EGA network as a node. So there's a link here in the bottom where you could find this and other materials, but briefly along the top part of this graph and sort of the reddish color icons represent steps sort of along the governance aspect of like how to set up a node and how it's going to be run, and deciding what your use cases are and users you want to serve. And then along the bottom in the yellow icons are some of the technical aspects of actually setting up the software and the standard operating procedures and doing some demonstrations. And these culminate in presenting the work to set up a node to one of our committees. We have a Federated EGA Strategic Committee. We also have an operations committee made up currently of representatives from the inaugural nodes. And so this ultimately culminates in the signing of the Federated EGA collaboration agreement between the central EGA and the node that wants to join. And at this point, there's a formal invitation to join the 2 committees, as well as receiving production credentials to connect to the Federated EGA network. And so we're excited to have some nodes at various points of this journey to onboard. One of the steps in the journey is to do a self-assessment against what we call the Federated EGA Maturity Model. So generally, a maturity model is a set of domains. There are 6 here listed on the left-hand side for Federated EGA that are areas to develop, and they cover governance and legal aspects, aspects about data management, technical infrastructure, setting up operations, and also community outreach and engagement. Each of these main 6 domains has any number of subdomains. And the idea is that each of these subdomains have a maturity level from 0 to 5, 0 meaning you haven't thought about this at all, 5 meaning you've implemented this subdomain and have an idea for how it will be sustainable moving forward. And the idea is that nodes will look at this maturity model and sort of assess where they are, identify gaps, perhaps to identify places to secure funding. And we've developed the maturity model alongside similar models being developed in a lot of these other, genomic data sharing projects, such as the B1MG, recently the GDI project and Healthy Cloud. So it's really becoming sort of a standard in these large data sharing operations to have this idea of a maturity model. And there's also a link here if you want to look at more details. We have an onboarding website now for onboarding new nodes into Federated EGA, which includes a lot of the information I've already talked about. And again, just to reiterate the importance of using shared standards, we use a lot of GA4GH standards to make sure that all of the data and the nodes are all interoperable to promote fairness of data and ease of use by researchers who want to discover and use data within the Federated EGA network. So finally, what are some exciting plans happening in 2023 for Federated EGA? So I mentioned the first nodes were onboarded at the end of last year, and we're now in the middle of completing some of the first data submissions to the Federated EGA nodes. We're starting with some synthetic data submissions just to prove the services work. And then nodes are in various stages of working with their first data submitters to sign the appropriate legal agreements and get the data and metadata in the right format. So we're really excited to see first data coming into the network this year. And in parallel, we're also helping to accelerate the addition of the second wave of national nodes, again, following that journey of what we've learned. And we hope to have at least a few nodes joining this year as well. And we'll continue to build upon the knowledge and expertise coming into the Federated EGA network from different nodes. We'll continue to add information to this onboarding website. We hold different webinars, Q&A sessions, Federated EGA panel sessions at various events. Our next one coming up is actually at the Elixir All Hands meeting. And also through support from some of our funded projects, as well as Elixir, we've been able to do some staff exchanges, which we found very helpful for especially setting up the technical aspects of Federated EGA. And we'll also continue to speak with different nodes, identify different use cases, understand how Federated EGA might evolve to support these use cases. We'll continue to advocate for the use of standards, of course, and ultimately hope to see the realization of this very ambitious mission set out by 1+ million genomes and continued by the European health data space, both within Europe and globally. So with that, just like to recognize our initial Federated EGA partners. The logos are here. They cover the first 5 inaugural nodes, plus the central EGA operations, and then especially our EGA team. So the team from both the EBI and the CRG. And you saw Teresa's slide earlier with all of the projects that we're involved in. So we're very fortunate to have lots of support from funders in various projects. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time. I will stop sharing, and I think I'll hand back over to Mark for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Mallory and Teresa, for really great presentations. Really nice overview of what you're doing in this really important initiative, and trying to understand the links between the different types of projects that are currently linked to the Federated EGA.